America was preparing for war. The Japanese bombing of Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, stirred an entire nation. Thousands of men were drafted and sent to training camps across the United States. Leaving the jobs they held behind, they became infantry soldiers, tank drivers, bomber pilots, medics, and cooks. A select few would serve their commitment as combat engineers. For the 308 Combat Engineer Battalion, the conversion from civilian life to life as a soldier took place at Camp Atterbury, Indiana. In 1943, training at Camp Atterbury was in full swing. The barracks were packed with recruits undergoing rigorous conditioning and instruction. But the 308th Engineer Battalion was in trouble. Attached to the 83rd Infantry Division, the 308th was performing poorly and was in disrepute with the division. The situation came to a breaking point during a training exercise simulating live combat. To create a more realistic environment for the soldiers, TNT charges were thrown into a stream. The explosions that followed simulated incoming artillery. The exercise was going as planned until one of the charges inadvertently ended up under a boat and detonated. Luckily, no one was seriously injured, but for the 83rd Division commander, it was the last straw. Without an effective engineer battalion, the 83rd Infantry Division would not be able to surmount the challenges which lied ahead. The 308th Combat Battalion commander was relieved, and a new commander was summoned. The call came to the commander of the 552nd Heavy Pontoon Battalion, Major Roy T. Dodge. Major Dodge left his battalion at Fort Gordon, Georgia, and reported to Camp Atterbury. As he walked into the office of the Chief of Staff of the 83rd Division, he was met by Colonel Ronaldo Van Brunt. A large, husky man with a commanding, domineering figure, Colonel Van Brunt examined Major Dodge with unashamed discontent. Major Dodge saluted and told the colonel he was reporting as ordered, ready to take command of the 308th Engineer Battalion. With an expression of disgust, the colonel cursed and asked, "How old are you?" When the young major told him he was 25, Colonel Van Brunt replied, "What are they doing to me now?" Despite the less than warm welcome, Major Dodge energetically took command of the black sheep of the division and began to get them in shape. While preparing for the war over the ocean, the 308 finally got the chance they were waiting for to prove their worth to the division. It was May of 1943, and the Wabash River was flooding. After 17 consecutive days of rain, the nearby town of Vincennes was threatened. The county called on the Army, and the Army called on the 308. The engineers were diverted from their training maneuvers to rescue the city. They arrived at Vincennes at 2 a.m., where Major Dodge was already in place and ready to brief them on the situation. "You have 2 hours to sleep, then we're going to get started," he said. Before the sun rose on the next day, the 308th went to work. The solution to the flood problem was not difficult, but it will require the muscle and sweat of everyone there. The city was protected by a concrete flood wall that, due to the heavy rain, would be about 3 feet too short to save the city from disaster. From morning till midnight, the battalion built wooden walls on top of the concrete and filled the walls with dirt. It was a fantastic amount of work for such a short time. About 3 hours after the project was completed, the Wabash River crested, but the wall held. The city of Vincennes was saved. The town was so grateful that they voted a Soldiers' Appreciation Fund of $1,000 and gave it to the battalion. Major Dodge used the money to buy silver charm bracelets for his men. The bracelets read, Vincent Flood, 1943. They were instantly local heroes. But the citizens of Vincennes were not the only ones to take notice of the 308.
Major Roy T. Dodge, you are to be commended for the leadership and ability you displayed during the recent flood disaster at the city of Vincennes, Indiana. The performance of the officers and men of Companies A's and C, 308th Engineering Battalion, was most commendable. This excellent work reflects the effective training of your command and your efficiency as a battalion commander. Signed, General F. W. Milburn, Major General, U.S. Army Commanding.
Major Dodge and the 308th Engineer Battalion had met their first real challenge with disciplined poise and determined tenacity. A few weeks later, Roy T. Dodge was promoted to Lieutenant Colonel, a month before his 26th birthday. The young battalion commander was proud of his battalion, but he knew there would be many more challenges to come. Hello, I'm Richard Dodge. Today it is my honor and privilege to share with you the story of the 308th Engineer Battalion and their amazing experiences and accomplishments during the Second World War. I'm especially excited to tell you the story of my grandfather, Roy Tinsley Dodge, the commander of the 308th and the division engineer of the 83rd Infantry Division. The 83rd Infantry Division was reactivated on August 15, 1942, under the command of Major General Frank W. Milburn. Formed at the outset of World War I, at the time the majority of its members hailed from the Buckeye State of Ohio. In 1942, this was no longer true. The 83rd comprised soldiers from all 48 states, but the unit kept its original insignia, gold letters superimposed on a black triangle, the letters spelling Ohio. The wearers of this shoulder patch were proud to be called the Thunderbolts. In December 1943, General Milburn left the 83rd Division to take command of the 21st Corps. His permanent replacement arrived a few days later. His name was Brigadier General Robert C. Macon. A veteran soldier with battle experience in North Africa, General Macon was to be the commander of the Thunderbolts for the duration of the war. In March 1944, after months of training and waiting, the word finally came. The Thunderbolts were alerted for overseas deployment. They said goodbye to their friends and family and immediately shipped off to the East Coast. Lieutenant Colonel Dodge said goodbye to his wife, Gwen, and to the newest member of their family, his 9-month-old daughter, Caroline Gwen Dodge. For the most part, the movement was kept a secret. In fact, the soldiers of the 83rd still didn't know whether their destination was Europe or the Pacific. In particular, every soldier was briefed on the importance of censorship, especially when it came to writing loved ones back home.
March 29, 1944. Dearest Gwen, I had a thorough lecture on censorship today, and now I'm afraid to say much. I think everybody is censorship conscious. They did say I could tell you I was in eastern United States now. Everybody's doing fine, except, of course, we all miss our wives. Most of the men are raring to go, I think. Your husband, Roy.
On April 6, 1944, the 308th and the rest of the Thunderbolts set sail. By now they knew their ultimate destination, England and the European theater. The 83rd crossed the Atlantic on a variety of American, British, and Canadian vessels. Lieutenant Colonel Dodge made his journey on the SS George Washington. The SS George Washington was built in 1908 for commercial passenger ferrying. In 1919, she was converted to a U.S. Army transport ship. Ironically, it was the SS George Washington that carried President Wilson to France for the Versailles Conference, in an effort to create peace for the European continent following Germany's first defeat and surrender. 25 years later, the situation was far from peaceful. Before he left the U.S. mainland, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge ordered 24 red roses that were delivered to his wife Gwen on Easter Day. She was now living in El Paso with their daughter Caroline. On Easter morning, on board the SS George Washington, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge wrote these words.
April 9, 1944. Darling, Easter morning at sea. I have just been to chapel services, and completing a letter to you this morning is very much in order. This was one of the most impressive Easter services I have ever attended. Out on the open deck with water as far as one could see on every side. During the service, it was possible to look back in the direction from which we came. All I could see is the horizon, but beyond that I could see all the family doing the same thing, maybe not at the same exact moment, and certainly not under the same circumstances, but still the same as far as thoughts were concerned. The chaplain spoke of the time when there was a dark hour and then Christ arose, and pictured this war as another dark moment, but also having a bright hour in the future for us. That has been our theme, not worrying about the present, but anticipating the reunion. Until then, happy Easter. God bless you and keep you. Your loving husband, Roy.
About 2 weeks later, the SS George Washington arrived at Liverpool, England. From Liverpool, the 83rd was split up and sent by train to a variety of English villages in the vicinity of Stoke-on-Trent, Staffordshire. The 308 was billeted in several mansions and estates in the surrounding countryside of the Midlands. Lieutenant Colonel Dodge and 2 of his companies stayed at Shavington Hall, an enormous estate owned by Lady Heywood Lonsdale. The battalion continued to train while occasionally taking the time for some rest and relaxation at local restaurants and pubs. The British people were happy to see the Americans join the war.
April 22nd, 1944. Somewhere in England. Dearest Gwen, the American soldier is going to spoil all the British kids, I fear. Everyone you see says, "Have you got any gum, chum?" And they usually get a piece. They are the cutest things with their rosy cheeks and accents. You would love this country. Everything is so clean and neat and quaint. You hardly see any automobiles, and everyone rides bicycles from 6 to 60 in both sexes. They are very friendly but reserved and very thrifty.
The preparation and training in the 308th Engineering Battalion continued for more than 2 months. In particular, the 308th trained in the construction of the British-designed Bailey Bridge. In time, the training on this bridge would prove invaluable. But their training was not limited to construction. U.S. Army engineer battalions were expected, if the need arose, to lay down their tools, pick up their rifles, and fight. Above all, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge prepared his men for battle, for the enemy cared not if his soldiers were holding a power drill or an M1 rifle. They had to be ready. D-Day was approaching fast. At 2 a.m. on the morning of June 6, 1944, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge was awakened by an officer from the division headquarters who had a simple but important message. The invasion of France would occur that morning. Just 2 days earlier, the Supreme Allied Commander, General Dwight D. Eisenhower, had made his final decision. Following a weather report that promised a short break in the overcast, rainy weather, the general and his staff concluded that they couldn't delay any longer. "I'm quite positive that the order must be given," he said. The Normandy invasion, codenamed Operation Overlord, was underway. Ship after ship departed the harbors of England and headed south for the Normandy coast. The 83rd Infantry waited. They listened overhead to the roar of thousands of Allied aircraft as they sped towards drop zones and targets behind enemy lines. 10 days after the initial invasion, The men of the 83rd were still held in reserve. Finally, on June 16th, the 1st Infantry soldiers of the mighty Thunderbolt Division boarded landing ships called LSTs and headed south across the English Channel. But the waiting would continue. Sergeant Ernie Hayhow was among the men waiting to go ashore. After the war, he was chosen to narrate the history of the 83rd Infantry Division in a book titled The Thunderbolt Across Europe.
The voyage from England to France was to have been short and fast for us. We rated a top priority in everything, for we were needed badly. The beachheads had been won, dearly won, but the men who had them were hard-pressed and were in need of assistance. We had to get there. We got top priority in everything but the weather, as we were rushed out of England and across the Channel. But we didn't rush into France. The weather had been against the Allies since D-Day, and now a great storm arose, seemingly out of nowhere, and prevented us from landing. For nearly a week the wind, rain, and the waves lashed at Omaha Beach and made life miserable for everyone. We roamed the decks, cleaned and recleaned our weapons, ate our landing rations. Days and nights passed, the monotony relieved only by the wonderment of what the immediate future held in store for us. Sergeant Ernie Hayhow, 83rd Infantry Division.
On the 23rd of June, the storm off the coast of France finally subsided, and the 83rd Infantry Division completed the last few hundred yards to the beaches of Omaha. There were hundreds of ships, some carrying mostly men, others carrying equipment and vehicles. For the 308th Engineer Battalion, the operation took 2 full days. The LST, which carried Lieutenant Colonel Dodge, went ashore at Omaha Dog White Beach. As he walked down the ramp to the sandy shore, his personnel command car rolled off the ship alongside his own at the exact same moment. Dodge later remarked that he thought this the biggest coincidence of the war. In this photo, he points to a bullet hole in that same car caused by enemy fire during the operation. By the 24th of June, the entire 308th Engineer Battalion was safely at the newly established gate to Europe. The battalion totaled 658 men, including 29 officers, 3 warrant officers, and 626 enlisted men. The battalion itself was divided into 4 companies, Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie, as well as a headquarters and service company, each with a captain in command. The 4 companies assembled, bedded down for the night, and awaited further orders from the division commander. The next day the orders came. The 83rd was going west to Carentan.
Carentan. This was the roughest and most hotly contested area in the entire American zone. Landing with their wings of silk the night before D-Day, the airborne infantrymen of the 101st fought alone, entirely surrounded by the enemy. They won their objectives on schedule and were now aligned with other American divisions, holding the ground they had so dearly gained. Under the cover of darkness on the nights of 26 to 27 and 27 to 28 June, riflemen, machine gunners, mortar crews, artillerymen, engineers, headquarters, and service troops of the 83rd Infantry Division moved into the front line positions and relieved their airborne comrades. We were already familiar with deep mud and the blackness of moonless nights, but now we were also face to face with a real enemy. We were firing at him, he was firing at us. Sergeant Ernie Hayhow.
As the 83rd closed in on Carentan, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge and the 308th Engineers encountered their first real challenges of the war.
We moved in immediately to Carentan. The 101st Airborne, which was commanded by General Maxwell Taylor, had dropped in and seized Carentan, which was sort of the hub there. So we moved in, and I went over with my division commander and other staff officers and met with General Taylor and his staff, and we proceeded to take over their positions. One of the biggest jobs I had, the 101st had laid mines out in front of them, so my job was to find out where all the mines were so we'd know when we launched our offensive. And of course, the airborne, having dropped in under very difficult conditions, had incomplete records as to where the mines were. In effect, we didn't know where the mines were, and when it came time for us to attack, we had to treat them as though they were enemy minefields, because the records were not good enough to trust. But after that, we started our offensive and ran into the hedgerows of Normandy, which was a real difficult situation. Our job as the engineers was to clear mines from the roads and prepare overlays for maps to tell all the unit commanders which roads had been cleared and which had not been cleared. That was the most popular publication of the division. The division artillery commander came by personally every day to pick up his copy of which roads had been cleared. That was one element. The other was to try to assist the infantry in getting through these hedgerows. Roy T. Dodge.
We found hedgerow fighting to be treacherous, rugged, nerve-wracking, murderous. Even now we find it hard to explain, for it almost defies description. One had to be there to really understand what it was like. Gnarled tree roots and vines as tough and strong as iron hoops, all woven together in an impenetrable wall. Sergeant Ernie Hayhow.
A hedgerow, as I'm sure everybody knows, is about 8 feet high. It's an earth bank, really, maybe 5 feet across at the bottom and 3 feet across the top. It's really an earth embankment. These tanks could not get over them or through them. When they hit the hedgerow, the tracks would ride up and the tank would just sit there. We'd take our bulldozers up and knock holes in them on occasion, but some bright fellow in the ordnance discovered that if you put a metal structure on the front, like a large spear, that this would dig into the bank and hold the nose of the tank down so that it would not ride up, and the tank could literally plow its way through. Roy T. Dodge.
We Thunderbolts celebrated July 4th, 1944 in a manner far different from any other July 4th we had known. To be sure, there were plenty of fireworks, but a deadlier kind than those back home. This was the date we launched our first attack. Sergeant Ernie Hayhow.
From Carentan, the 83rd Division advanced south into France, hedgerow by hedgerow. Their goal was to take Brittany before the Germans had the chance to regroup and counterattack. As they battled from village to village, the 308 typically stayed in the rear in support of the infantry troops. But as the 83rd pushed further into the heart of France, the intensity of the fighting increased. In particular, one of the Thunderbolt infantry regiments was so devastated that a gap began to form in their lines. The 308th Engineer Battalion was called on to fill in the gap. They put down their minefield charts, dismounted their bulldozers, and picked up their rifles to join the front line of battle.
July 10, 1944. Dearest Gwen, we have been engaged in some heavy fighting for some time now. I believe we're doing all right, but it has been pretty rough at times. To say the least, it is an experience that I have never seen surpassed. Some things are the most spectacular I have ever seen or heard, and some are hard on the stomach. Artillery fire kills a lot of cattle, and they lie all over the place and stink, which is the beginning. There are more heroes than I had ever imagined in the battalion. A Heine popped up out of the hedges right on top of 3 of my men with a machine pistol the other day, and one of my quick basketball players was one of my men, and he snapped his rifle up with one hand and fired from the hip and got him before he ever had a chance to fire a shot. Another ran quite a distance under fire to give some sulfa pills to a man who was wounded and couldn't be evacuated. I don't know whether I should tell you all this or not, because it may get you unduly alarmed. There is no need to worry. Love, Roy.
Lieutenant Colonel Dodge's officers continued to perform heroically. On several occasions, the 83rd Commander, General Macon, commended the 308 for their superb achievements. On July 22nd, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge wrote back to his wife in El Paso. He had recommended one of his finest officers, 2nd Lieutenant Robert E. Jane, for the Silver Star. A native of St. Paul, Minnesota, Lieutenant Jane was known back home as an expert fencer and a dramatic artist. He often recorded his feelings on the war through poetry. His poem, All These the Brave, speaks of the dedication and sacrifice of the men of the 83rd Infantry Division. All these the brave who fall upon a bleeding plain, so swift are gone, that scarce can each one realize for what he lives or what he dies, and in what game he plays upon. Some men may weep to look upon the tragedies of each new dawn. They have no time to waste in sighs, all these the brave. They vigils keep from dawn till dark, nor rest until the battle's won, or lost, or till the blazing eyes stare blindly at the once loved sky. Keep faith, lest they in vain are gone, all these the brave. In early August of 1944, the 83rd continued their campaign into Brittany. Their next orders came from the 8th Corps Commander, Major General Middleton. The 83rd was assigned to capture the port towns of St. Malo and Dinard, known as the Twin Cities. Now fighting under General Patton's 3rd Army, the Thunderbolts once again went on the attack.
We remembered Blood and Guts, for we trained under him in England, where on a visit he told us in plain infantry language what he thought of the Germans and how we could beat them. Now he paid us another visit and checked our plans for the assault on the Twin Cities. While part of the 3rd Army was knifing into other parts of Brittany, other units raced for Paris and the Seine. We were to tackle this mission on our own. There would be no friendly divisions on our flanks. It was to be strictly a Thunderbolt show, and we really put on a show. Sergeant Ernie Hayhow.
Realizing the importance of the two cities of St. Malo and Dinard, Adolf Hitler organized the construction of a massive defensive system in the area. In fact, over 500 bunkers were built to protect the region, both on the north side, on the coast, and further inland to the south, to protect against an attack from all directions. With reinforced concrete walls 2 meters thick and hundreds of cannons and machine guns, the initial advantage was clearly on the defense with the Germans.
Donc, je de la Télévision 5. Et là, objectif américain, c'est quoi? C'est bien sûr Saint-Malo, de prendre le port intact. Parce que les Américains, ils savent très bien que s'ils prennent Saint-Malo intact, ils pourront faire venir par la suite des renforts en hommes et en matériel par la mer. Mais si les Américains y ont pensé, les Allemands aussi, et sur ordre d'Adolf Hitler, les soldats allemands ont sauté tout le port de Saint-Malo dans la nuit du 7 au 8 août 1944. Ils font sauter le grand môle qui part avant-port au tronçon. Ils font sauter les quais, les grues, les ponts, les écluses et plus de 120 bateaux dans les bassins, le rendant ainsi inaccessible.
As the Thunderbolts began battling for the German strongholds on the way to St. Malo, other units attached to the 83rd made their way south in order to cross the Rance River on the way to Dinard. The quickest way to get there was to cross the river at the city of Dinan.
I'm standing now in the old medieval city of Dinan. Directly behind me, you see what the locals call the Old Bridge, and further behind that is a second bridge, which crosses the gorge, and was the main road used to travel west into Brittany. As the Germans fled west to the Brittany coast, they destroyed both bridges. This was forcing the 83rd Infantry Division to travel many miles south in order to cross the river as they pressed north towards the port city of Dinard. They needed both bridges repaired. Lieutenant Colonel Dodge and the 308th Engineer Battalion got the call. Directly below me are the two arches which the German demolitions teams destroyed as they headed west across the river at Dinan. Actually, this bridge of Dinan was constructed in 1852 as a viaduct used to carry water into the thriving city of Dinan behind me. But in August of 1944, this was the main road into the heart of Brittany.
On the afternoon of the 5th of August, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge and Company A of the 308 began work on two bridges to cross the Rance River. The first bridge was a Class 9 floating bridge. This bridge was used to quickly move reconnaissance elements across the river in preparation for the construction of the main bridge over the Dinan Viaduct. Lieutenant Colonel Dodge decided to use the British Bailey design to cross the gap over the two destroyed arches of the stone bridge. The training he and his men had done while waiting in England was about to pay off. The Bailey Bridge is a highly versatile bridge. It was later recognized as one of the most valuable pieces of equipment in World War II. A Bailey Bridge is made of welded lattice panels, each 10 feet long. It was pieced together like a puzzle using steel pins to form girders of varying length and strength. Depending on the situation, the Bailey Bridge could be constructed to accommodate a variety of loads and spans. A 120-foot span Bailey, for example, could support up to 78 tons. The bridge built at the Dinan Viaduct was called a Class 40 double-double, meaning it was 2 panels wide and 2 panels high. Working at night, at over 200 feet above the water, the construction was extremely hazardous. In addition, several Germans still held positions on the far side of the bridge. Their small arms and mortar fire made the project even more dangerous. Nonetheless, by 0645 the next morning, the 140-foot bridge was ready for traffic. All in all, the companies Alpha, Bravo, and Charlie constructed 2 Bailey bridges and 4 footbridges in the vicinity of Dinan, opening the path to the north towards Dinard. As the 83rd pushed into the 2 port cities on either side of the Rance estuary, the 308 engineers were a critical part of the offensive. They destroyed barricades and bunkers. They cleared the way through minefields and removed booby traps. On occasion, they again joined the infantry in the fighting, sometimes using flamethrowers to drive back the German positions. When the 83rd finally reached the town of St. Malo on August 9th, they found the majority of the remaining German resistance in the citadel located at nearby St. Servan. As they moved into the city, German shells were still crashing down on the area from Dinard and the offshore island of Cézanne. The 308th engineers struggled to find a weakness in the citadel. For 4 nights straight, engineers climbed over the fortifications to drop pole charges through the citadel's vents and ports. They had little effect. German artillery attacks rained down on the engineers as they worked, preventing any real progress. In the end, it took the capture of Dinard, now accessible due to the bridges at Dinan, as well as an intense artillery bombardment using white phosphorus shells on the fortress to force a surrender. On August 17th, the German commander, Colonel von Aulich, surrendered himself along with his remaining 571 officers and men. In all, the 83rd had captured over 12,300 prisoners during the campaign, but it was a costly battle. The Americans had taken their objective, but the cities were all but completely destroyed. Nonetheless, the French citizens were glad to see the Germans defeated. They were again free.
August 29, 1944. Dear Gwen, you have probably read of the reception newly liberated French towns are giving to the Americans. I'm telling you, it is something. They seem to have an abundance of tomatoes. I was leading the convoy the other day and must have collected a bushel of them. The people line the streets as for a parade and toss the tomatoes into your lap. Sometimes they misjudge your speed and tomatoes surely splatter. The helmet is a good defense against apples, though. Love, Roy.
On entendra les garçons chanter de belles chansons, tout sera clair. Et voilà, mes petits copains, qui sont partis un matin faire la guerre. Et voilà.
We had been accustomed by now to publicity, to hearing the name of the 83rd mentioned in radio newscasts, to having our front lines and command posts visited by many reporters representing various publications in the States and in the United Kingdom. But the attention the world was about to pay us was far more than we had expected. Sergeant Ernie Hayhow.
On August 25, 1944, after 4 years of German occupation, Paris, France was liberated by French troops. The Allies were beginning to pick up momentum. The majority of the 83rd Infantry Division left Brittany and traveled southeast. Their new tasking was to protect the southern flank of the fast-moving Third Army as it surged deeper into Europe towards Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands. But the German presence in France had not yet ended. Thousands of German troops still remained in the south. General Macon and his men spread out along the north bank of the beautiful Loire River. From the Bay of Biscay to just east of Orleans, the Thunderbolts held their ground along a 185-mile stretch of land, an enormous distance to defend for just one division. As they patrolled east and west along the slow-moving river, the Germans continued to fire on them from the southern bank. Then, one day, to the puzzlement of the 83rd commanders, the south bank of the Loire River grew strangely quiet. The commander of the 329th Infantry Regiment, Colonel Crabbill, summoned his intelligence and reconnaissance platoon leader, First Lieutenant Samuel W. McGill. "Sam," he asked, "what's happened to all those Germans who were shooting at us from the other side of the river?" Sam McGill and his platoon crossed the river and quickly established contact with the French underground, also known as the FFI or Maquis. They informed McGill that the Germans had withdrawn further to the south. More importantly, they mentioned they had indications that there was a German element of unknown strength that was willing to surrender to Americans, but not to the French. McGill traveled south towards the small town of Issoudun, his jeep bearing a white flag to make known his peaceful intentions. The lieutenant eventually made contact with General Erich von Elster. At the bridge leading into the village, the general and McGill began to discuss the possibility of a surrender. "I came here to see you because your cause is hopeless," McGill said. "I know you're trying to get back to Germany, but thousands of troops are in your way now waiting for you to come in range. I thought if I came to talk to you, you would see that you could surrender with honor and save the lives of your men who will otherwise die unnecessarily." Sam McGill awaited a response. Based on the resistance he had met in his journey from the Loire to Issoudun, he estimated the German strength to be no more than 2 battalions. "What?" General Elster replied. "Surrendered 20,000 men to your platoon?" Lieutenant McGill almost fell off the Issoudun Bridge. The current strength of the entire 83rd Infantry Division was only around 16,000, but McGill kept his bearing. It was not the platoon which was important, he remarked, but the inevitable clash of arms which awaited the column up ahead. General Elster stopped for a moment, thinking about his tired but determined men. He agreed to surrender to the Americans if they would provide an adequate show of force so that they might surrender with honor. McGill reported the information back to Colonel Craville, who then passed the information on to General Macon. Meanwhile, Lieutenant McGill set up a temporary headquarters at the Hotel d'Angleterre in the village of Romorantin. Negotiations continued. With the Thunderbolts spread critically thin along the Loire, General Macon could not afford a show of force on land. At the suggestion of Lieutenant McGill, however, an aerial show of force by American bombers was organized and agreed upon by General Elster. American bomber planes had punched the Germans almost daily. The damage and casualties had been great. A few days later, in full view of the German commander and his men, a flight of American bombers made a convincing pass at German positions near the Issoudun Bridge. The display satisfied von Elster, and the arrangements for the official surrender began to take place. As reports of the coming surrender returned to the 308th Engineer Battalion, Lieutenant Colonel Roy Dodge immediately realized that the 83rd Infantry Division had no place to house 20,000 German prisoners. In fact, the upcoming surrender was to be the largest surrender of German forces for the entire war. The battalion immediately began the construction of prisoner-of-war cages. At the orders of General Macon, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge took a plane down to the river and began a 2-day survey of the land. His mission was to determine how the Thunderbolts were going to get all those men across the Loire River. As the construction of the POW cages began, German soldiers marched north in 3 main lines. Strangely enough, the soldiers were allowed to keep their weapons. Because events were happening so quickly, the Allies were not able to get word about the surrender to all the French forces in the region, and they feared the Maquis might fire on the marching columns. Finally, on September 16th at 1500 local, General Elster and his staff formed up at the site chosen for the official ceremony. The site was located at a bridge which crossed the Loire River to the north and into the town of Beaugency, France. Only now the bridge was destroyed. Dozens of reporters from Paris arrived to document the scene. As a token of his surrender, the German general presented the 83rd commander with his pistol. General Macon accepted, and the surrender was complete. Lieutenant Colonel Dodge later described the event in a letter to his wife.
Yes, the 20,000 prisoners gained quite a bit of publicity. I don't think you'll find me in any of the pictures. I was standing off to the side during the surrender ceremony. Do you remember my mentioning the plane trip the night I had dinner at the chateau? Well, anyhow, that's where I went to figure out how to get all that mess across the river. And just to let you know I had something to do with it, I was the one that selected Beaugency as the crossing place. With the general's approval, of course.
Following the ceremony, the German weapons were confiscated and the soldiers were escorted across the river and into the cages prepared for them by the 308th Engineers. General Erich von Elster and his staff car were ferried across the Loire River and into captivity, compliments of Lieutenant Colonel Dodge and the 308th Engineers. Dodge took pictures of the ferry and eventually sent them back to his wife. Under one photo, he simply wrote,
Von Elster gets a free ride. Should have made him swim.
In late September, the 83rd left the Loire River Valley and headed east towards the infamous Siegfried Line. To the north, on the Netherlands front, Operation Market Garden had failed to capture the strategic bridge at Arnhem. It seemed the Germans were beginning to hold their ground. The 83rd now moved into Luxembourg. Relieving the 5th Armored and 28th Infantry Divisions, the Thunderbolts took up positions along the Moselle River. Significant pockets of enemy forces still remained on the west side of the river. Village by village, the 83rd drove the German forces across the Moselle. 83rd artillery units went after the enemy rail units, knocking out several enemy troop and supply trains. During this campaign, the ancient city of Trier was also an objective for ground and aerial bombardment. The 83rd Infantry Division held their ground in the region around Luxembourg. Their hopes of being home by Christmas were long gone by now. There was much work left to do. Nonetheless, the Thunderbolts somehow managed to find time to relax and enjoy themselves. The challenges that they had overcome had indeed brought them closer together. They had joined the 83rd as young boys, as strangers. Through the hardships and triumphs of the past several months, they were now without question men, with bonds of friendship that few people could understand. And in between the marching, the fighting, and the dying, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge and the 308th Engineer Battalion made the best of the brief intermissions of war.
Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. No, no, no. Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. Till I come marching home. Don't go walking down Lover's Lane with anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. No, no, no. Don't go walking down Lover's Lane with anyone else but me. Till I come marching home. I just got word from a guy who heard from the guy next door to me. The girl he met just loves to pet and it fits you to a T. So don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me till I come marching home.
Don't give up with those lips of yours to anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. Anyone else but me. No, no, no. Watch the girls on the foreign shores. You'll have to report to me when you come marching home. Don't hold anyone on your knee. You better be true to me. You better be true to me. You better be true to me. Don't hold anyone on your knee. You're getting a third degree when you come marching home. You're on your own where there is no phone and I can't keep tab on you. Be fair to me, I'll guarantee this is one thing that I'll do. I won't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but you till you come marching home.
Don't sit under the apple tree with anyone else but me. I know the apple tree is reserved for you and me. And I'll be true till you come marching home.
November 24, 1944. Dear Gwen, yesterday was Thanksgiving here. We really had turkey galore. Lieutenant Clary invited me over to A Company for the noon meal. Captain Brandt is in Paris on a pass. And I ate with the headquarters staff in the evening. Both were very good. I got cloyed. We're doing fine. I have never seen so much rain, though. It never seems to cease and leaves me continually concerned for fear some of my bridges or ferries will wash out. All my love, Roy.
After 2 months in Luxembourg, the 83rd Infantry Division received new orders. They marched north towards the Hurtgen Forest. Their objective was to relieve the 4th Infantry Division. For the Thunderbolts, it was the first time they would fight on German soil, their first engagement with the enemy in his homeland.
Approximately in the center of the triangular area marked by Aachen, Düren, and Cologne lay the Hurtgen Forest. It was here that the men of the 4th Infantry Division were fighting, and dying. In this thickly wooded forest, Jerry easily concealed himself and his weapons. It was a forest of death. There were many Heine snipers. There were machine guns, mortars, and camouflaged and entrenched Nazis with rifles and burp guns. Besides all this, there were the ever-deadly tree bursts, artillery shells fired so that they would explode near the tops of the trees and send fragments flying in all directions. In places, nearly every tree contained a booby trap, and nearly all the space between the trees was covered with mines. The terrain lent itself naturally to the defense, and the Hun was exploiting his many advantages to the utmost. Sergeant Ernie Hayhow.
Once again, the 308th Engineer Battalion was responsible for the removal of mines. On the roads leading through the Hurtgen Forest, the 308th Engineers were using every means available to clear a path for the advance. While their methods were sometimes unconventional, they were opening roads in record time. On the South Road leading into the town of Gay, Lieutenant John Pisarik and his men of Company C were pulling out mines by attaching a wire to the handle of each mine, taking cover, and then yanking. Pisarik found this method too slow, so he and his men simply pulled the mines out by hand and tossed them to the side of the road. Slowly but steadily, the 83rd pressed east towards Düren and the Rohr River. The fighting was intense. German artillery was the most unremitting and concentrated the Thunderbolts had received during 5 months of combat. On the 18th of December, members of Company A crossed the Rohr River, entered Düren, and became the closest Americans to Berlin to that date. By Christmas Day, 1944, they took the town of Winden. The Thunderbolts had completed their final objective in the Hurtgen Forest. They had effectively hurdled the Hurtgen. Christmas Eve, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge wrote back to his wife from the 83rd Infantry Division Command Post in Kriewinkel, Germany.
Christmas Eve in Germany. It is now 11:30 p.m. and Christmas is almost here. Tonight is one of the most beautiful nights I have ever seen. It is a cold, clear night. The ground is frozen hard and a white fringe of frost is growing. The moon is almost as light as day, and the stars are very bright and clear. One of the men remarked that he almost wished we were on guard so that he could stand out and watch it without appearing foolish. You'd be surprised at the number of decorated trees that have sprung up. There's no question of where they found the trees, but where the ornaments came from, I can't imagine. Probably salvaged from the rubble of the houses of this crushed little village we're in. The name of the village has a Christmassy sound even. Well, God did all he could to make it a beautiful Christmas, but man has added a note over here that nullifies any thought of celebration, festivity, and joy that might have been prevalent. As you know from the news, very few people here have time for more than a brief thought that it is Christmas. And in describing the night, I neglected to add that the horizon is speckled with bursting flares of light, and the distant and sometimes not too distant thunder is ever present. Yes, God has done his bit towards peace, happiness, and goodwill on earth, and I can picture his sadness at the response. However, I feel that the American soldiers are fighting now to attempt to attain and preserve those things which some people choose to ignore and even destroy. Even the terrific onslaught that is taking place at this morning is going to hasten that day. Therefore, I feel no sadness at not observing a joyous Christmas this year. If by going through one like this, I can help ensure that Caroline can have many, many of the kind I imagine her having tomorrow, then mine is well spent. I can almost picture her happy little face tomorrow morning and how she will buzz from one new toy to another until she tires herself out. Then, for many mornings afterwards, she will.
After operations in the Hurtgen Forest concluded, the men of the 83rd Infantry Division had little time to catch their breath. In their last major offensive of the war, the Germans commenced a fierce attack which pierced Allied lines in the region of the Ardennes. Thrusting deep into Belgium and Luxembourg, they took back territory from the Roer to the Meuse River. Under the cover of overcast winter weather, they drove west, temporarily hidden from aerial reconnaissance and bombardment from the Allied air forces. In the process, the Germans surrounded the Belgian town of Bastogne, but the 101st Airborne Division was refusing to give up. Cut off from all supplies, the 101st was holding the town, despite the harsh winter conditions. But they couldn't hold out for much longer. The Allies quickly regrouped and counterattacked in what later became known as the Battle of the Bulge.
In the Battle of the Bulge, we were on the north flank. We kept moving out along the nose of the bulge. Later, we came back to the neck of the bulge and from the north side. It was our division, the 83rd and the 84th, and two armored divisions that were driving from the north towards Bastogne, while Patton was driving from the south towards Bastogne.
Patton's Third Army arrived in Bastogne first, with the Ninth Army close behind. What was left of the town of Bastogne and its inhabitants were saved. Eventually, the weather cleared, and the Allied Army and Air Forces worked together to once again drive back the Germans.
Day and night our attack continued. Langelier, Petit Langelier, Guihain, Bobigny, Coty, and Pognelet were the small towns which we captured after fierce fighting and bitter cold. But our victory in the Ardennes cannot be measured by towns captured or by miles gained. We did not advance far as compared to some of our other successes, but we never fought harder, were never faced by stronger opposition than that which we encountered in the Bulge. Sergeant Ernie Hayhoe.
By February 1945, the Bulge had been completely eliminated and the Allies' former front lines were restored. Both sides now took the opportunity to rest, regroup, and retrain. The 83rd moved back to Germany and began to make preparations for their next major objective, crossing the Roer River and driving east to the Rhine River. On the morning of the 23rd of February, members of the 330th Combat Team and the 29th Division successfully launched an assault across the Roer River. By the 1st of March, the Thunderbolts were also across the Roer and quickly assigned their next objective, the three bridges at Neuss and Oberkassel. These bridges crossed the Rhine into the city of Dusseldorf. The Allies had yet to capture a bridge on the Rhine intact. As Allied forces approached from the west, the Germans were retreating across the river and blowing the bridges. The 83rd feared the same might happen to them at Neuss and Oberkassel. In his book titled Citizen Soldiers, Stephen Ambrose describes the 83rd Infantry Division's unique attempt to secure the bridge at Oberkassel.
The great goal, almost surely impossible, was to get a bridge. So desperate were the Americans that they used a ruse, that they had earlier executed dozens of Germans for using. The 83rd Division assembled a task force of German-speaking GIs, put them in German uniforms, provided them with tanks and other vehicles disguised and camouflaged to look like German models. The task force set out after dark, March 2nd, talked its way through the German lines, and at dawn reached the Rhine at Oberkassel. A German sentry challenged the call. A firefight broke out. The task force was strong enough to fight its way to the bridge, but the noise of the battle alarmed the town's air raid warden, and he set off the alarm. The German engineers at the bridge took that as the signal to blow it, just as the American tanks were rolling up.
The men of the 83rd Division were not the only forces to fail to secure a bridge across the Rhine. In fact, the Germans succeeded in blowing all the bridges on the Rhine except for one. On March 6, German engineers hastily set charges to the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen, but their initial attempts to blow the bridge failed. So serious was this failure in the eyes of Hitler that he immediately assumed treason and had 6 of his officers tried by a special court and sentenced to death. On March 7th, the U.S. 9th Armored Division took the bridge at Remagen. 10 days later, the bridge collapsed into the Rhine. On March 20th, 1945, Major Louis Dorr, representing the Provisional French government, held a small ceremony in Büchen, Germany. The purpose was to recognize certain members of the 83rd Infantry Division who had distinguished themselves in the operations to liberate France. The medal awarded that day was the French Croix de Guerre. Among these men was the 83rd Division Engineer, Lieutenant Colonel Roy Dodge. By the end of March, the Allies had a firm grip on Germany's last natural barrier. French, British, and American engineers completed successful assault crossings of the Rhine River, from the town of Ries in the north to Strasbourg in the south. The 83rd Division pulled back from the region of Oberkassel and settled once more into portions of Luxembourg and the Netherlands. For the 308th Combat Engineers, there was one last major hurdle on the way to Berlin, the Elbe River. Once again they began training, crossing and recrossing the Maas River, fine-tuning the skills they had already proven effective. Finally, on March 30th, the Thunderbolts crossed the Rhine River near Wesel, Germany. General Macon and the 83rd Infantry Division had received new orders. The 9th Army's 2nd Armored Division was to push east towards the Elbe River at the city of Magdeburg. To the north, their left flank was protected by the 30th Infantry Division, and to the south, their right flank was protected by the 83rd. The priority of this next drive was speed. With the Russians closing in on Berlin from the east, the Germans were desperately fighting a two-front war, and they were losing ground fast. For the 83rd Infantry Division, speed was not an easy task. The trucks formerly utilized to motorize the 83rd Division had been returned to supply dumps the day preceding the issuance of this order to replenish a now well-depleted stock. The advance order came when trucks were not available. Thus, any and all transportation was gathered together. The Thunderbolts used whatever they could get their hands on to keep the momentum going. Tanks and jeeps, confiscated German cars and trucks, fire engines, bicycles, and even wheelbarrows. They might not have looked like a professional army division, but somehow they were keeping up with the swiftly moving 2nd Armored.
We were later referred to as the Ragtag Circus, but to us it was no circus. Admittedly, however, we may have looked like a summer carnival group entering a country town as we dashed along the highways and byways of the Prussian provinces, for we pressed into service every conceivable means of transportation we encountered. If it had wheels, we used it. Sergeant Ernie Hayhow.
As they raced for the Elbe, the 83rd encountered moderate resistance from the German army. Many German soldiers seemed somewhat disappointed at the response they got when they put up the white flag and surrendered. Lieutenant Colonel Dodge described the scene in a letter he wrote to his wife on Easter Sunday, April 1st, 1945.
Now, what is in a way amusing, the real honest-to-gosh soldiers on the road. Everybody is too busy advancing to worry about getting prisoners to the rear. They have surrendered and had their weapons taken, but now no one will pay any attention to them. They appear first insulted, then bewildered, and finally, I think, a little hurt because they aren't considered important enough to be fussed over. So there they are, looking pathetic. It is amusing.
Day after day, the 83rd sped towards the Elbe River. Once they crossed the Elbe, they knew they would be no more than 2 or 3 days from the German capital. They were eager to put an end to the war. April 5th would mark the 1-year anniversary of the day they left America and set sail for the European continent. The fact that Berlin was now on the horizon gave the men of the 83rd the extra motivation they needed. Despite the rapid pace and nights of little sleep, they pressed onward. For the 308th Engineer Battalion, the greatest challenges of the war lied ahead. In order to assist in the upcoming operations, the 308th received assistance from additional engineer battalions attached to the 83rd. These battalions, including the 295th Engineer Battalion, worked under the division engineer. Under the command of Lieutenant Colonel Dodge, together these engineers successfully crossed the Weser and Rhine rivers. On the evening of April 12th, the 2nd Armored Division reached the Elbe River near the town of Magdeburg and began the construction of the first pontoon bridge. Just hours later, at 1300 local on the 13th, the 83rd reached the river at a point south of Magdeburg, at the town of Barbie. Amazingly, they had kept pace with their better-equipped partners to the north. In only 13 days, the ragtag circus had traveled 280 miles. As the 2nd Armored Division began the assault crossing of the Elbe near Magdeburg, German artillery units turned their guns towards their positions and opened fire. American casualties were heavy. The onslaught damaged their bridge and forced the 2nd Armored to withdraw from the bridgehead and hold their ground. With the successful attack on the 2nd Armored Division, the Germans now looked south towards Barbie and the 83rd Infantry Division. Assessing the layout of the surrounding area, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge established 2 possible locations to bridge the Elbe at Barbie. The first was a partially demolished railroad bridge directly east of the town. The second was an old ferry site about 1,000 yards south of the rail crossing. After determining that it was not feasible to repair the damaged rail bridge, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge began preparation for the construction of a treadway bridge at the old ferry site. However, suspecting the possibility of aerial reconnaissance, Lieutenant Colonel Dodge ordered the initial assault crossing to occur nearer the railroad bridge. Sure enough, as the engineers and infantrymen crossed the river in their portable boats, an enemy reconnaissance plane circled the area. The plan had worked. Just 2 hours later, assuming the bridging would take place at the rail bridge, the German artillery began shelling the then unused crossing site and the railroad bridge. Meanwhile, well to the south of the attack, 83rd Engineers began ferrying tanks, tank destroyers, ammunition vehicles, and infantry troops across the river in order to establish a secure bridgehead to the east. At 1500 local, the engineers started rolling in the bridge materials, and by 1900 local, the bridge construction began. Working on minimal sleep, the 83rd Engineers built a floating bridge across the 200-yard expanse of the Elbe. Upon hearing the tragedy of President Roosevelt's death on April 12th, The engineers agreed to name the bridge in honor of his successor. The construction became the Truman Bridge. By 0730 on the morning of the 14th, the Truman Bridge was complete. It became the first Allied bridge across the Elbe River. 83rd Infantry units immediately began pouring across the river into the forests and nearby towns on the eastern side. By this time, the Germans were well aware of their initial mistake about the crossing location, and Lieutenant Colonel Dodge realized that two things must be accomplished as soon as possible. First, the construction of a second bridge over the Elbe was critical, not only to hasten the crossing of troops headed towards Berlin, but to act as a backup in the event that the first bridge was destroyed. The next objective was the security of the bridge. Building the second bridge across the Elbe would require additional crossings of nearby tributaries. On April 15th at 2200 local, the 83rd Division engineers started the construction of a pontoon bridge across the Saale River. The bridge was completed by the next morning. By daybreak on the 17th of April, the first phase in the construction of the second bridge over the Elbe at Breitenhagen began. By late afternoon, having had no interference all day, the bridge was in full operation. The 83rd now had two fully operational bridges across the Elbe. To secure the two existing bridges, the 83rd had already established a formidable defense on the eastern side of the river, thus preventing the opportunity for a counterattack by ground forces. In order to protect against inevitable air attacks, anti-aircraft units were quickly established at the bridgeheads. But Lieutenant Colonel Dodge was also concerned about German attempts to blow the bridges through the use of mines and underwater demolitions teams. Upstream of the bridges, the engineers constructed what is called anti-mine booms. They used steel cables supported by logs to string across the river. The cables, independently anchored below the surface of the water, would trigger the mines before they reached the bridge. In addition, riflemen were positioned at advantageous points upstream as well as on ends of every fifth pontoon of the bridge. During the crossings, 15 floating mines were exploded by the booms and the rifle fire, and none reached the bridges. Finally, to protect against underwater demolitions teams, strands of barbed wire concertina were lowered into the water. During the hours of darkness, a sentry in a boat anchored upstream would drop 5-pound TNT charges into the water at 5-minute intervals. Once again, these methods worked without fail. 3 German swimmers equipped with rubber suits, oxygen respirators, and a 3,200-pound torpedo bomb attempted to sabotage the crossings. The defenses held, and all 3 were eventually captured. Later interrogations revealed that the swimmers became entangled in the barbed wire and lost control of their bomb. One swimmer was seized with cramps caused by the explosives and a resulting tear in his suit.
April 21, 1945. Dear Gwen, our Thunderbolts division has certainly been busy these days. The BBC has mentioned us quite a bit since our mad dash in the bridgehead. It has certainly kept me busy crossing rivers. The Germans object very much to my having any bridges across the Elbe. I can really tell you some tales about that someday. They took quite a few pictures of our bridges, and maybe they will appear in some of the papers. If they do, you will probably notice that the 308th didn't build them, which reminds me. There are usually other engineering units working for me. I usually have at least one additional battalion with me. At any rate, even though the sign doesn't mention the 308th, you can rest assured that they are the ones who really made the thing go. All my love, Roy.
By the 14th of April, the 2nd Armored Division had begun using the 83rd Division's bridge at Barbie to cross the Elbe on their way to Berlin. Allied forces pushed as far as the town of Zerbst and then held their position. The excitement among the American troops was infectious. They longed for their orders to move out. But on Sunday morning, 15 April, the 9th Army commander, General Simpson, was summoned by General Bradley to his Army headquarters at Wiesbaden. They shook hands as he climbed out of the plane. Bradley, without any preamble, told him that the 9th Army was to halt on the Elbe. It was not to advance any further in the direction of Berlin. The order had come from Eisenhower himself. Due to political reasons, the Allies had agreed to let the Russians take Berlin. The Americans were to wait at the Elbe until they could make contact with the Russian army. They moved the majority of their forces to the west side of the river and held their ground. Just like that, the war was over for the 83rd Infantry Division. They had finished the job they had come to do, and they had done it well. By the end of April, the Russians had taken Berlin. On April 30th, Adolf Hitler and his new wife committed suicide in their hidden bunker in Berlin. Fearing that the Russians would put his body on display, his men burned his remains.
April 30, 1945. Dear Gwen, the radio said it, so I guess I can too. We met the Russians this afternoon. Now I can rest a bit easier. These past 3 weeks have really been dillies. I can tell some of it now, I guess. The paper I sent tells all about our drive of over 200 miles in 14 days. 4 assault river crossings, 3 in 1 week, including the Elbe. And the thing that makes me happiest, I had not a single battle casualty. It is unbelievable when I think what 200 yards in the hedgerows cost me. Even the shelling of our Elbe bridgehead. I guess God and luck were with us. To get on with our tale, no sooner had we finished our first bridge than the Heine trick started. First the strafing and bombing. They came out second best. Then floating marine mines. And to cap it off, underwater swimmers complete with rubber suits, respirators, and immense torpedoes. I can't tell all the countermeasures we took, but the bridges are there and the mines and swimmers aren't. I wonder if I will remember all the things I want to tell you about when I get home. Rumors fly thick and fast these days. Peace rumors, when we go home, Pacific prospects. Boy, there are some good ones. Most are dreams expressed out loud, and everyone listens for all they're worth, but wishing and hoping. Love, Roy. May 8, 1945, VE Day, Germany. Dearest Gwen, I can't let VE Day pass without a note, even though I don't feel very much elation just yet. I am truly glad this war is over. Now, if the Japs would quit, I would really want to celebrate. What was the reaction in the States? According to the radio, England is going to take a 2-day holiday. I imagine there will be something similar in the States. The bad part of it is the guys who did all the fighting have to work as usual. We are all tied up with guarding and military governing. That has to be, though, so it is understandable. Part of winning the peace, I guess. Our real celebration, I think, will be when we are told that we are heading home. Boy, you can imagine what that will do for morale. Your husband, Roy.
With the war over in Europe, the 83rd Infantry Division moved to Passau, Germany. The Thunderbolts now took part in the occupation forces, which would temporarily govern the war-torn region. However, they continued to train, all the while expecting that at any moment they might be called to join the war in the Pacific. But by mid-August 1945, World War II officially ended with the surrender of Japan, hastened by the use of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. By the fall of 1945, the division moved to Austria. Little by little, the men of the 83rd were allowed to go back home. Those that remained were mostly regular Army, and they continued as a part of the occupation forces until the 83rd Infantry Division was officially disbanded in early 1946. For Lieutenant Colonel Dodge, the adventure in Europe was far from over. With the end of the war came the reorganization of many of the remaining Army units, which were now transitioning to peacetime operations. Lieutenant Colonel Dodge was made a construction group commander in Austria, commanding 3 new engineer battalions, in addition to the 308. One by one, these battalions received orders to return to the States, but Lieutenant Colonel Dodge was ordered to remain in Austria. Finally, in the summer of 1946, Gwen Dodge and the now 3-year-old Caroline boarded a ship and traveled across the ocean to reunite with Roy. The happy family lived together in Austria for nearly a year. In June of 1947, Lieutenant Colonel Roy Dodge left Europe for his first assignment in the United States since the war began. He and his family moved to Ithaca, New York, where he began his master's in industrial engineering at Cornell University. He later became an instructor of tactics at the Department of Military Art at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. There he taught Army engineers the lessons he had learned during World War II as the commander of the 308th Engineering Battalion. Roy Dodge and his wife Gwen later had 2 more children, Dick and Betsy. He continued his career in the Army at such locations as the Pentagon, Harvard, and Turkey and in Korea. Finally, on October 1st, 1967, Roy Dodge retired as a brigadier general, having faithfully served his country for 29 years. But his engineering career was not complete. Roy Dodge went on to become the Chief of Design and Construction of the Washington, D.C. Metro from 1967 to 1978. He was credited by friends and critics of the Metro with keeping what was the nation's largest public works project free of the corruption and influence peddling endemic to big city, big ticket ventures. On November 8, 2002, the former commander of the 308th Engineer Battalion, retired Brigadier General Roy Tinsley Dodge, died of complications from lung cancer at the Fairfax Retirement Community at Fort Belvoir, Virginia. He was later buried with full military honors at Arlington Cemetery on 17 December. Brigadier General Roy Dodge was an amazing man. He was known, perhaps most of all, for his absolute devotion to integrity. He demanded honesty and fairness from himself and others. He was a superb officer and an outstanding engineer. He was a loving husband and father. He was a loyal friend to many. To a new generation of Dodges, he was a devoted grandfather. In fact, he was more than a grandfather. He was a hero. He was my hero.
Roy Dodge's legacy continues today in the lives of his family. His son, Dick Dodge, graduated from West Point with an engineering degree. He later went to flight training and became a helicopter pilot for the U.S. Army. 3 of his grandsons and 2 of his granddaughters joined the military and became officers in either the Army or the Air Force. All 5 graduated college with engineering degrees. One grandson is currently in Air Force ROTC at a university in Texas, and not surprisingly, he too will soon graduate with a degree in engineering.
My current U.S. Air Force assignment is at Geilenkirchen Air Base here in Germany, not far from where my grandfather journeyed just half a century ago. Things have changed since then. As an American Air Force pilot flying in a NATO squadron, I fly side by side with Belgians, Dutch, British, and even German pilots. We fly to keep the peace, and by working together, we help guarantee the peace for our generation and the next. But we will never forget the perseverance and sacrifice of the men who fought to regain that peace. Men like my grandfather, General Roy Tinsley Dodge, an American engineer in World War II.
And now Joan Merrill has a bit of musical advice as she sings with the chorus, "You Can't Say No to a Soldier."
Listen, little lady, it's the order of the day, issued by the highest of authority. Fellows in the service simply can't be turned away. You know that defense must get priority. So if you're patriotically inclined, heed the call to arms and keep this thought in mind. You can't say no to a soldier, a sailor, or a handsome marine. No, you can't say no if he wants to dance. If he's gonna fight, he's got a right to romance. So get out your lipstick and powder. Be beautiful and dutiful too. If he's not your type, then it's still okay. You can always kiss him in a sisterly way. Oh, you can't say no. No, you gotta give in if you want him to win for you.
You can't say no to a soldier, a sailor, or a handsome marine.
No, you can't say no if he wants to dance.
If he's gonna fight, he's got a right to romance. So get out your lipstick and powder. Be beautiful and dutiful too.
If he says it's cold on those submarines, you can knit a sweater, but that's not what he means.
Oh, you
drove down to the river and found the current civilian ferry in operation at the site that the 83rd used in crossing the river with their own pontoon. And where I'm standing now, we walked up the river, actually down the river towards Barbie to the point where the assault crossing was made. It was probably about 300 meters from where I'm standing across towards the woods over there. Fortunately, the enemy saw the assault crossing and directed their artillery over at the site of the start of the assault crossing, and the ferry site down here was not bothered, and it allowed the site to be completed and large reinforcements to be moved across to support the very successful bridgehead. Several days later, further down the Seal River, a crossing was made up to the Eld to enlarge the size of the beachhead, and in that manner they were able to have a good solid position against possible enemy counterattack. It was very successful, and it showed the great advantage of a quick assault river crossing with trained infantry.